The wind that scoured the town of redemption was a liar. It whispered of cool relief, but carried only heat and the taste of red dust, fine as milled flour. From the hellish glow of his smithy, Elias Boone watched the town shimmer and warp under the midday sun. The clang of his hammer on the anvil was a steady, lonesome rhythm, a penance he paid from dawn to dusk. It was the only sound that could drown out the ghosts. Today another sound broke the rhythm. Not the lazy creak of a wagon or the distant braying of a mule, but the sharp crack of a gunshot followed by another. It came from the direction of the Redemption Bank and Trust. Elias's hammer halted mid-swing, the silence that followed, ringing in his ears. Men shouted. A woman screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was cut short. Through the wide-open doors of his smithy, he saw them 4 riders, their faces masked by bandanas, moving with a predator's economy. Their leader dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He was taller than the others, dressed in a black duster that billowed around him like a storm cloud. He moved not with the frantic energy of a common thief, but with a chilling theatrical poise. Elias's hands, slick with sweat, tightened around the hammer's handle. His body, long dormant, coiled with a forgotten tension. Every instinct, honed over a decade of wearing a U.S. Marshal's star, screamed at him. But he was Elias Boone, blacksmith. The Marshal was dead, buried 5 years ago in a shallow grave alongside his wife and daughter. The leader of the outlaws emerged from the bank, a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He paused on the boardwalk, surveying the terrified townspeople who had scattered for cover. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way. A thin smile played on his lips as he addressed the cowering town. "Fear," he called out, his voice clear, "and carrying is a form of prayer, you know. A prayer to a God who never answers." He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Behind him, the bank manager, a portly man named Abernathy, was shoved out onto the steps by one of the outlaws. He stumbled, his hands raised in surrender. "Please," he whimpered. "You have the money. Just go." The leader, Silas Kane, turned his head slowly. The smile vanished. "It was never just about the money, Mr. Abernathy. It's about the message." With a movement so fast, it was almost a blur, Kane drew his Colt Peacemaker, leveled it, and fired. The shot was deafening. Abernathy collapsed, a neat, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The message, it seemed, was one of absolute finality. As Kane holstered his pistol, his duster swung open. Something small and silver slipped from his pocket, catching the sunlight as it fell. It landed in the thick dust of the street with a soft clink unnoticed by the outlaws as they mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and terror in their wake. Elias remained frozen, the heat from the forge forgotten. His world had narrowed to that single glittering point in the street. He knew what it was. He knew its weight, the delicate engraving on its surface, the way the clasp clicked shut. He had held it 1,000 times. He dropped the hammer. It clanged against the anvil, a sound of discordant finality. He walked out of the smithy, his boots kicking up puffs of red dirt. The townsfolk were beginning to emerge, their faces pale with shock. No one paid him any mind as he crossed the street and knelt beside the spot where Silas Kane had stood. His fingers, calloused and stained with soot, brushed away the dust. There it was, a small silver locket shaped like a heart. On its surface, 2 initials were entwined in elegant script, S and E. Sarah and Elias. He picked it up. The metal was still warm from the outlaw's body. He pressed the tiny clasp and it sprang open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of his wife, Sarah, her smile as gentle as a prairie sunrise. On the other, a portrait of his daughter, Lily, her eyes bright with a life that had been stolen. The sight was a key turning a lock in the deepest, most fortified chamber of his memory. The dam of his carefully constructed silence broke, and the past came flooding back, not as a memory, but as a living nightmare. The canyon walls bled red in the setting sun. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Lily, only 6 years old, was laughing, chasing a butterfly. Sarah was spreading a blanket, her voice a soft hum as she sang a lullaby. He was a marshal, then escorting them to a new life in California, a life away from the blood and dust of his profession. He had promised her it would be safe. A foolish, arrogant promise. The first shot came from the rocks above. A high, whining crack that sent a puff of dust from the canyon wall near his head. Then another and another. Ambush. He'd reacted on instinct, shoving Sarah and Lily behind the wagon. "Stay down," he'd yelled, his voice raw with a sudden clawing terror he had never known in 100 gunfights. He drew his revolvers, returning fire at the muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers in the deepening shadows. There were too many. A voice beside him, his deputy's voice, shouted his name. Elias, to the left. A bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around. He saw Sarah, her face a mask of terror, trying to shield Lily with her own body. He saw a man with a scarred face take aim. He fired, but his shot went wide. The scar-faced man's rifle bucked, and Sarah crumpled without a sound. Lily screamed a sound that ripped the world in two. He remembered lunging forward, roaring with a grief so profound it was a physical force. He remembered emptying his guns, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling his lungs. He remembered the silence that fell afterward, a silence broken only by the sound of his own ragged breaths and the wind whispering through the canyon. He was back in the dusty street of redemption, the silver locket digging into his palm. The sun beat down on his bare head. The world was a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. He was shaking not with fear, but with a rage so cold and deep it felt like it could freeze the sun. Silas Kane, the man who had murdered Abernathy with such casual cruelty. The man who wore his dead wife's locket. The past wasn't buried. It had been waiting. And now it had a name. Elias Boone, the blacksmith, was dead. In his place, something older and far more dangerous had been resurrected. He closed his fist around the locket, the metal edges biting into his flesh. And for the first time in 5 years, the ghost of the marshal looked out through his eyes. The hunt was on. The smithy, once a sanctuary of sweat and fire, became a cage. For 3 days, Elias worked without pause, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a furious, ceaseless drumbeat against the anvil of his grief. He forged horseshoes, repaired wagon wheels, and sharpened plowshares, his movements mechanical, his mind a maelstrom. Each spark that flew from the hot iron was a memory of a muzzle flash. Each hiss of steam as he quenched the steel was the echo of his daughter's last scream. The locket lay on the workbench, its silver heart a constant, silent accusation. His life in redemption had been an act of deliberate erasure. He had arrived 2 years prior, a man with no history and fewer words, his past packed away, like a set of worn-out tools. The townsfolk knew him only as Boone the blacksmith, whose silence was as solid and unyielding as the iron he worked. They respected his skill and kept their distance, sensing the invisible walls he had built around himself. It was a simple, hollow existence, and until now it had been enough. On the 4th day, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, a new shape appeared at the edge of town. It was a broken-down farm wagon, pulled by a single, exhausted horse. At the reins sat a woman, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Huddled in the back, amidst a meager pile of soot-stained belongings, were 4 small children. This was Clara Hollander. News of her plight had trickled into town on the wind, her husband dead from a fever, a month past her farm on the outskirts of the county, burned to the ground by raiders, leaving her and her children with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a future as bleak as a winter sky. Elias watched from his doorway as the wagon groaned to a halt near the general store. He saw Clara step down her movements, stiff with exhaustion. He saw the store owner, Mr. Gable, come out, shake his head with a look of practiced pity, and offer her nothing. He saw the town's preacher, Reverend Miller, approach her, speak a few sanctimonious words about the Lord's mysterious ways, and then walk away, his duty done. Door after door, face after face, closed to her. The town of Redemption offered no such thing. By nightfall, the wagon was parked in a scrub-choked alley between the saloon and the livery stable. A cold wind had picked up, and the children's thin blankets were no match for it. Elias closed the doors to his smithy, trying to shut out the sight of them, but their silent misery seeped through the wood. He could not forge away this image. He could not hammer it into a different shape. It was the memory of Lily, her small hand in his, that finally broke his inertia. He had failed to protect his own. He could not stand by and watch another family be consumed by the unforgiving wilderness. He packed a satchel with bread, cheese, and a thick wool blanket. Stepping out into the moonless night, he walked toward the alley. The sounds of raucous laughter spilled from the saloon, a stark contrast to the desperate quiet huddled in the wagon. Clara looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with fear in the gloom. Her eldest son, a boy of about 9 named Thomas, moved to stand in front of his siblings, his small frame a defiant, trembling shield. Elias stopped a few feet away. He said nothing, simply held out the satchel. Clara stared at it, then at him, confusion warring with suspicion in her gaze. "We have no money to pay you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Elias shook his head, pushing the satchel forward. Thomas flinched, but Elias's movements were slow, deliberate. Finally, Clara's hand, chapped and thin, reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and the brief contact was like a spark of warmth in the encroaching cold. He turned to leave his duty done when a voice from the wagon stopped him. Was it the dark-clothed men? Elias turned back. It was Thomas, his voice shaking but clear. "The men who burned our farm. One of them." He smiled while he did it. He said justice was a beautiful fire. Elias's blood ran cold. Justice is a beautiful fire. The phrase was a chilling echo of Silas Cain's theatrical pronouncements in the street. He looked at Clara, and in her haunted eyes, he saw a reflection of his own loss. Cain's path of destruction hadn't started in redemption. It had cut a swath right through this family's life. His simple act of charity was no longer enough. Cain had linked their fates. "There's a cabin," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Just outside of town. Belongs to me. It's warm." Clara clutched the satchel to her chest, her expression unreadable. To accept his offer was to place her family's fate in the hands of a stranger, a silent, grim-faced man who looked as haunted as she felt. But to refuse was to condemn her children to another night of cold and hunger, perhaps their last. The youngest child, a girl named Annie, began to cry a thin, exhausted wail. That sound made the decision for her. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible. Elias simply nodded. He unhitched her weary horse, tied it to the back of his own sturdy mule, that he kept tethered behind the smithy, and loaded the children into his wagon. He helped Clara onto the seat beside him. As they rolled out of the alley and away from the judgmental eyes of the town, and the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the shared weight of survival, a fragile truce with a world that had tried to break them both. His cabin was a small, rough-hewn structure nestled in a grove of cottonwoods a mile from town. Inside, a stone hearth dominated one wall, and a fire was soon blazing, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The cabin was sparse, containing only a bed, a table, and a few chairs, but it was clean and above all safe. While the children huddled by the fire, devouring the bread and cheese with a quiet desperation that twisted Elias's gut, he examined Clara more closely in the firelight. A dark bruise marred her cheek, and a long, ugly gash was hidden at her hairline, matted with dried blood. "Your farm," Elias said, his voice low. It wasn't just the fire. Clara flinched, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked at her children, ensuring they were distracted by the food. They were looking for something, she said, her voice trembling. They kept asking about a lawman who passed through these parts years ago. A marshal. She finally met his eyes, a flicker of dawning recognition in their depths. They described a man like you. The connection was now a steel chain, binding him to this family's tragedy. Cain wasn't just on a rampage. He was hunting. He was hunting him. And he was burning down the world to find him. Elias said nothing. He fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth. He knelt before her, and with hands surprisingly gentle for a blacksmith, began to clean the wound on her head. Clara stiffened at his touch, then slowly, hesitantly relaxed. Her shame and fear were palpable, a suffocating blanket she had been carrying for weeks. As he worked, their eyes met again. In that shared gaze, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were two ghosts haunted by the same demon. For Elias, offering shelter was no longer a choice. It was a duty. He had to protect this family, not just from the cold, but from the storm that was coming for him. And in doing so, perhaps he could find a sliver of the redemption this town was so ironically named for. The town of redemption did not grant redemption easily. Elias's decision to shelter the widow Hollander and her children became the grist for the town's gossip mill, churning out whispers of scandal and sin. When Elias led Clara and her 4 children into Gable's general store for supplies, a hush fell over the patrons. Eyes followed them, filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. Women pulled their skirts aside, as if Clara's misfortune were a contagion. The self-righteous judgment of the town found its voice in Reverend Miller. On Sunday, he stood at his pulpit and preached a sermon on the wickedness of the fallen woman and the men who enable their disgrace, his gaze pointedly drifting towards the empty pew where Elias never sat. The pressure mounted. A delegation led by the preacher and a few of the town's more pious matrons arrived at Elias's cabin one afternoon. They found him splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a clear warning. Clara stood on the porch, her children clustered behind her like frightened chicks. Mr. Boone, the Reverend, began his tone, oozing condescending concern. The town is worried. For this woman's reputation and for yours. It is not proper for her to be living under your roof unmarried. Elias rested his axe, leaning on the handle. His gaze was flat and cold as riverstone. She and her children have food and a roof. Is that not proper? It is a matter of Christian decency, one of the women sniffed. What will people say? Elias's jaw tightened. Let them say I didn't leave a widow and 4 orphans to starve in an alley. If your Christian decency finds fault with that, then I want no part of it. His blunt refusal left them sputtering. Defeated by his unyielding silence, they retreated, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. But Elias knew this was only a temporary victory. The town's scorn was a slow-acting poison. Sheriff Brody Miller, a man whose polished badge was the shiniest thing about him, paid a visit the next day. Unlike the others, Miller was smooth, his questions wrapped in a veneer of professional concern. Heard you had some trouble, Elias, he said, leaning against the porch rail. Miller wasn't the town's sheriff. He was the county lawman, but his presence was a constant reminder of the order Elias had left behind. Just wanted to check on Mrs. Hollander. Make sure she's all right. She's fine. Elias grunted, continuing to sharpen a scythe blade. This outlaw, Cain Miller, continued, his eyes sharp and probing. The one who hit the bank. Mrs. Hollander seems to think his gang is the same one that burned her out. You know anything about that? I know what she told me. Strange, isn't it? A gang that vicious, hitting small-time farms. Doesn't seem worth the risk. Miller paused, watching Elias's face for any reaction. Unless they weren't looking for money. You've been here a couple of years, Elias. Quiet man. Ever crossed paths with a fellow like Silas Kane before? The question was a baited hook. Elias kept his expression impassive, focusing on the whetstone's rhythmic scrape against the steel. If I had, I'd remember. Miller smiled a thin, knowing expression. I'm sure you would. Just be careful, Elias. A man with a past can't ever be too careful. It has a habit of catching up. The sheriff's visit left a sour taste in Elias's mouth. Miller's questions were too precise, his interest too keen. He was fishing, and Elias couldn't be sure why. The confrontation with the town forced Elias's hand. He could not keep Clara and her children in this limbo suspended between charity and scandal. That evening, as the children slept, and the fire crackled in the hearth, he sat across the table from Clara. He placed the silver locket on the rough-hewn wood between them. Clara gasped, her eyes fixed on the entwined initials. It belonged to my wife, Elias. Said the words costing him more than all the gold Cain had stolen from the bank. He told her everything. About Sarah and Lily. About the ambush in the canyon. About his life as a marshal and the guilt that had driven him into self-imposed exile. When he finished, the silence in the cabin was thick with shared sorrow. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his, which was clenched into a fist around the locket. Her touch was hesitant yet firm. My husband, Daniel. She began, her voice soft but steady. He was a good man. A farmer. He knew nothing of fighting. When the fever took him, I thought the worst had already happened. I was wrong. The world has a way of finding new ways to hurt you. She looked at him, her eyes clear and resolute. You are not to blame for what happened to your family, Elias. You are not to blame for what happened to mine. Her words were a balm on a wound he thought could never be soothed. In her he saw not a burden, but a reflection of his own resilience. A survivor. The town won't let this be. He set his voice low. They'll drive you out. Then let them, Clara replied, a spark of defiance in her eyes. I have been driven out before. I am still here. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had weathered starvation, loss, and scorn. He saw the fierce love she had for her children. He saw a future he hadn't dared to imagine, a life that was more than just an endless penance. There is another way, he said slowly. He stood up, walked to a small dusty chest in the corner, and retrieved a simple, unadorned gold band. It had been his father's. He placed it on the table next to the locket. Marry me, Clara. It was not a declaration of love, not a romantic proposal. It was a pact, a fortress, a shield against the world. It was a promise of protection, of shared burdens, of a name that would shelter her and her children from the storm. Clara stared at the ring, and then at his face. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Elias. He had publicly defended her. Now he would bind himself to her. It was a defiant act, a challenge to the town, to Silas Cain, and to the ghosts of his past. He was no longer just hiding. He was building something new from the wreckage of his life. In the weeks that followed, a fragile domesticity settled over the cabin. The union of Elias Boone and Clara Hollander was a marriage of necessity, but it slowly blossomed into something more. He taught her sons Thomas and Samuel how to track game and read the sky for weather. He carved a small wooden robin for Maggie and a tiny perfect canoe for Annie. Clara, in turn, brought a quiet order to his chaotic life. The cabin began to smell of baking bread instead of just wood smoke and solitude. Laughter, faint and tentative, at first began to fill the spaces between the log walls. But beneath this peaceful surface, Elias was a man at war. Every night after Clara and the children were asleep, he would sit by the fire cleaning the Colt Peacemaker he had not touched in 5 years. The muscle memory was still there, the efficient, deadly grace of a man who had lived by the gun. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a marshal again, hunting the most dangerous quarry of his life. He began to piece together Cain's movements, using the skills he had tried so hard to forget. He rode out speaking to homesteaders and trappers in the surrounding territories. The stories were all the same: a charismatic outlaw leader, a gang that struck with military precision, and a trail of seemingly random violence. But Elias saw the pattern. Cain wasn't moving randomly. He was circling, drawing a tighter and tighter noose around redemption. Each burned-out farm, each raided stagecoach, was a point on a map that led inexorably to him. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and pride. She saw the change in him. The haunted emptiness in his eyes was being replaced by a cold, hard focus. He spoke little of his investigation, but she saw it in the way he studied the horizon, in the tension in his shoulders when a rider approached on the main road. They grew closer in the quiet moments. They talked of their past lives, not with the raw pain of fresh wounds, but with the gentle melancholy of accepted scars. He told her about Sarah's love for books, and she told him about Daniel's knack for making things grow. They were tending to the gardens of each other's memories, finding solace in the shared soil of their grief. Elias found himself smiling at the children's antics, found himself looking forward to the simple meal they would share at the end of the day. He was beginning to feel again, and it terrified him as much as it healed him. The turning point came with news from a neighboring county. A posse had cornered one of Cain's men after a botched robbery. The man was wounded, captured, and being held in the jail in dusty Cedar Flats. Elias knew he had to go. "I'll be back in 2 days," he told Clara, strapping on his gun belt. It felt alien and familiar all at once. Clara didn't try to stop him. She simply packed him a satchel of food and water. "Be careful, Elias," she said, her hand resting on his arm for a moment. It was the first time she had touched him with such familiarity, and the simple gesture spoke volumes. The ride to Cedar Flats was a journey back in time. The weight of the gun on his hip, the creak of the saddle, the vast, unforgiving landscape, it was all part of a life he thought he had escaped. The jail was a squat stone building baking in the sun. The local sheriff, a weary man with a drooping mustache, led Elias to the cells. The captured outlaw, a young man named Billy, lay on a cot, his leg crudely bandaged and stained with blood. He was pale with fear and pain. Elias pulled up a stool, his shadow falling over the boy. "I want to talk about Silas Cain." Billy spat on the floor. "Ain't telling you nothing." Elias leaned forward, his voice low and devoid of threat, which somehow made it more menacing. "I'm not the law. Not anymore. This is personal. He has something that belongs to me. I want to know why." He saw a flicker of something in the boy's eyes. He pressed on. "Cain's methods are tactical. He plans. He doesn't leave things to chance. He's not just an outlaw, is he?" Billy's bravado began to crumble. "He's different. Smarter than the rest of us. He talks like a preacher sometimes. Says we're not just stealing, we're collecting a debt. Says the world owes him." "What debt?" Elias pressed his voice like iron. The boy hesitated, then the story spilled out of him, a torrent of fear and whispered jailhouse rumors. "He talks about the old days, when he rode with a marshal, a famous one. Said the marshal was a hero to everyone, but he was a coward. Said he left him to die. In some canyon. Years ago." The air left Elias's lungs. The cells seemed to shrink around him. The canyon, the ambush, the deputy who had shouted his name, the man he had seen fall, who he had presumed dead along with everyone else. What was his name? Elias asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Before he was Cain." Billy looked at him, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror, as if he finally understood who he was talking to. "Cain," the boy stammered. "His name was Silas Cain. Silas, his deputy, his friend. The man who had been with him that day. The man he had mourned. The man he thought he had failed." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a random act of a psychopath who had stumbled upon his wife's locket. This was a ghost from his own past, risen from a bloody grave? Silas believed Elias had abandoned him. This entire reign of terror, the robberies, the murders, the burned-out farms, it was all a long, twisted path of vengeance. A path leading directly to him. The conflict was no longer about a stolen locket. It was about two men bound by a shared tragedy, each believing the other was a betrayer. Elias walked out of the jail, the sun blindingly bright. He saw it all clearly now. Silas wasn't just coming to kill him. He was coming to destroy everything Elias had, just as Silas believed Elias had destroyed everything he had. And now Elias had something to lose again. He had Clara. He had the children. The ride back to redemption was a race against time. His mule's hooves pounding out a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. He's coming. He's coming. He's coming. He arrived back at the cabin under a sky bruised with the colors of an impending storm. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that mirrored the turmoil in his soul. He found Clara on the porch, watching the horizon, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She knew. She had felt the shift in the world, the approach of the coming darkness. He dismounted, his face a grim mask. "We have to leave," he said, his voice flat and urgent. "All of you. Now." He strode past her into the cabin and began throwing their meager belongings into sacks. Clara followed him, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "Elias, what is it? What happened?" He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a desperate intensity she had never seen before. "His name is Silas Kane. He was my deputy. He was with me in the canyon." The words came out clipped and harsh. "He thinks I left him to die." "He's not just killing for sport, Clara. He's hunting me. He's been leaving a trail of bodies to draw me out, and now he knows where I am. He knows about you." The truth settled in the small cabin, vast and terrible. The children, sensing the fear in the air, grew quiet, their eyes wide and frightened. "He sent a message," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of cottonwood bark, intricately carved into the shape of a hawk's feather. He placed it on the table. "Silas and I, we used to pass the time on long patrols by carving. This was his mark. He left this on the sheriff's desk in Cedar Flats. It's for me. He's telling me he's close, and he's telling me he knows I'm coming for him." He looked at Clara, his gaze pleading. "He will come here. He will use you and the children to get to me. I cannot let that happen. I will give you my horse, and you will take the children and ride east. Don't stop until you reach St. Louis." Clara looked at the carved feather, then at the fear and guilt warring in her husband's eyes. She saw a man preparing to sacrifice himself to protect them, a man ready to face his demons alone. And in that moment, her own fear was burned away by a fierce protective resolve. She stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, forcing him to look at her. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Clara, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her grip tightening. "I have spent the last year running. My husband died, and I ran from the farm that held his memory. My home was burned, and I ran from the ashes. I came to this town and ran from its judgment. I will not run again." She looked at her children who were watching them, and their small faces pale. "This is our home now. You are my husband. Your past is my past. Your fight," she said, her eyes locking with his, "is my fight. We will face him together." Elias stared at her, stunned into silence. He had offered her an escape, a chance to save herself and her children from the violence that clung to him like a shroud. And she had refused. She had chosen to stand with him, not as a victim to be protected, but as a partner. Her courage was a shield, and for the first time since the ambush, He did not feel entirely alone in his fight. A fragile hope flickered within him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the grim reality of their situation. Silas was not just one man. He had a gang of ruthless killers with him, and they were coming to redemption. The sky outside darkened further, the wind beginning to howl through the cottonwoods. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to spatter against the roof. A storm was breaking both outside and within the walls of their small cabin. "All right," Elias said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair for a brief moment. It was a gesture of both surrender and acceptance. Together, he released her and turned his focus, immediately shifting to survival. "We'll be safer in town, with the others." He began to issue quiet commands, his voice that of the marshal he once was. "Thomas, you and Samuel barricade the windows. Clara, pack only what we can carry, water and food. Maggie, Annie, stay close to your mother." As they worked, a single, horrifying thought echoed in Elias's mind. Sheriff Miller, his probing questions, his convenient appearance, his knowledge of Elias's past. Had he been fishing for information for himself or for someone else? The unease he'd felt about the sheriff curdled into a cold, hard suspicion. The enemy might not just be outside the town, but already within its heart. The first peal of thunder rattled the cabin, and the wind screamed like a banshee. The dust storm was coming, and with it, Silas Kane. The storm hit redemption like a physical blow. A roiling brown wall of dust consumed the sky, swallowing the sun and plunging the world into a suffocating ochre twilight. Wind shrieked through the streets, tearing at shingles and rattling window panes. The town hunkered down, a tiny, vulnerable island in a sea of chaos. Elias herded Clara and the children through the gale towards the center of town. The church built of sturdy stone was the safest place. As they fought their way through the blinding dust, they saw them. Riders. Dark shapes moving through the storm like phantoms, their forms distorted by the swirling grit. Kane's gang. They weren't waiting for the storm to pass. They were using it as cover. Panic erupted. Townsfolk caught in the open screamed and scrambled for shelter. Gunshots cracked sharp and deadly, cutting through the howl of the wind. Elias shoved Clara and the children through the heavy oak doors of the church just as Kane and his men descended. He saw them rounding up the remaining people in the street, forcing them at gunpoint towards the same sanctuary. The church was already crowded with terrified citizens. Reverend Miller stood near the altar, his face ashen, wringing his hands. Mr. Gable, the store owner, was trying to barricade a side door with a pew. Sheriff Miller was there too, his revolver drawn, trying to project an aura of calm that was betrayed by the sweat beading on his brow. "Everyone stay down," the sheriff yelled, his voice thin against the roar of the storm outside. The main doors burst open and Silas Kane stepped inside, framed by the swirling brown maelstrom. He was no longer the dusty outlaw from the bank robbery. He was an avenging angel cast in shadow and dust, his black duster whipping around him. Two of his men flanked him, rifles held ready. "Good people of redemption," Silas announced, his voice cutting through the din. He swept his gaze across the terrified faces, a theatrical smile on his lips. His eyes found Elias standing protectively in front of Clara and her children. The smile widened. "And you, Marshal? I'm so glad you could make it. I was worried you might have run off again." Elias didn't answer. He pushed Clara and the kids further behind him, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "There's nowhere to run this time." Silas continued, taking a slow step forward. "No canyon to hide in. Just this holy little box filled with all the things you seem to care about now." His gaze flickered to Clara, cold and appraising. "This is between you and me," Silas Elias said, his voice a low growl. Oh, it was Silas laughed. "It was for 5 long years while I was rotting in a prison camp, dreaming of the day I'd find the man who left me to bleed out in the dirt. But then I heard you'd found a new life, a new family, and I realized my revenge was far too small. You didn't just take my life, Elias. You took my future. So now I'm going to take yours." He gestured to his men, who began herding the hostages, including Clara's children, towards the front of the church, separating them from their parents. Maggie cried out for her mother. "Let them go," Elias roared, taking a step forward. A gun was cocked behind him. "I wouldn't do that." Boone Sheriff Miller said, his voice shaking. The revolver that had been meant to protect the town was now pressed firmly into Elias's back. Betrayal, cold and sharp, pierced through Elias. He glanced back, his eyes locking with the sheriff's. Miller's face was a mess of fear and sweat. "Why Miller?" Silas chuckled. "Sheriff Miller is a practical man. Aren't you, Brody? He understands the shifting tides of power." The truth crashed down on Elias with the force of a physical blow. "The ambush," he breathed. "It was you. You were the informant. The gang was paying for information on payroll shipments." Miller stammered, his eyes darting around wildly. "I didn't know they'd hit you. I never knew they'd kill your family. I swear." "But you knew Silas survived," Elias stated, the pieces clicking into place. "And when he came back, he owned you." "He has a point," Silas said conversationally. "Secrets are a much stronger chain than steel. Now drop the gun belt." Slowly, with Miller's gun in his back and his new family held hostage, Elias had no choice. He unbuckled his belt and let it fall to the floor. He was disarmed, surrounded, and betrayed. The trap was sprung. Silas sauntered forward, picking up Elias's gun. He examined it with a connoisseur's appreciation. Everything comes full circle. Justice, Elias. It's a beautiful, terrible thing. He gestured to the altar. "Now, on your knees. You're going to repent for your sins before this whole town watches you die." As Elias was forced to his knees, his mind raced. The howling wind outside, the flickering lantern light, and the terrified faces of the townspeople, the glint of steel in Silas's hand. He saw Clara, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with defiance. He saw Thomas standing straight and tall beside his siblings, trying to be brave. He had lost one family because he couldn't protect them. He would not lose another. He knelt, but he was not broken. He was a cornered wolf, gathering himself for one last desperate strike. The dust storm raged, and inside the church, in the heart of redemption, and the final battle for his soul had begun. The storm howled, rattling the stained glass windows of the church, as if trying to tear them from their leaden frames. Dust seeped through the cracks, mingling with the scent of fear and lamp oil. Silas Kane stood before the altar like a dark preacher, Elias's own revolver in his hand. 5 years, Elias Silas began, his voice a low, mesmerizing sermon. 5 years I spent thinking about that canyon. The sound of the gunshots, the smell of blood. I remembered you shouting. I remembered you fighting. And then, I remember the silence. You just left me. You saved yourself, and you left me there for the vultures. There was no one left alive. Elias retorted, his voice raw. I thought you were dead, Silas. I mourned you. Did you? Silas sneered, his face contorting with a sudden vicious rage. Did you mourn me while you were building this new life? Did you mourn me when you took this woman into your bed? He gestured wildly at Clara. You erase the past, Elias, but the past doesn't forget. From the corner of his eye, Elias saw movement. Thomas, Clara's eldest, was inching sideways, his gaze fixed on a heavy brass collection plate resting on the edge of a nearby pew. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A desperate, unspoken plan passed between them. You're wrong, Elias said, raising his voice to draw Silas's attention back to him. You weren't left for dead. You were captured. The same men who killed my family took you. Why didn't you say anything? Why this madness? Because justice isn't something you're given in a courtroom by fat judges, Silas roared. It's something you take with fire and with blood. I learned that from you, Marshal. At that moment, Thomas moved. With a cry of desperate courage, he grabbed the heavy plate and hurled it with all his might. It spun through the air, striking the lantern hanging above Silas's head. The lantern crashed to the floor, shattering and spilling burning oil across the dry wooden planks. Flames erupted, spreading with terrifying speed. The church exploded into chaos. The hostages screamed and scrambled back. Silas's men, startled, turned towards the fire. Sheriff Miller, his nerve finally breaking, fired his gun wildly into the ceiling and tried to bolt for a side door. It was the opening Elias needed. He lunged not at Silas, but at Miller. He tackled the sheriff, wresting the smoking revolver from his grasp. As they hit the floor, Elias saw one of Cain's men take aim at Clara. Without thinking, Elias fired the sheriff's gun. The outlaw crumpled. Silas turned his face, a mask of fury, and fired at Elias. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Elias's arm, sending a searing pain through him. He ignored it, rolling behind a pew and returning fire. The shootout was frantic and brutal, a maelstrom of noise, smoke, and fire inside the howling dust storm. Clara acted instantly, gathering her children and the other townsfolk, shoving them towards the vestry door at the back of the church. "This way, hurry," she yelled, her voice a beacon of command in the panic. Elias laid down, covering fire, his shots precise and economical. He was no longer a blacksmith. He was the lawman, every instinct sharp, every movement calculated. He took down another of Cain's men as the outlaw tried to stop the escaping hostages. Now it was just him and Silas. The fire was raging, consuming the pews and sending thick black smoke to the ceiling. Through the inferno, the two former partners faced each other. "It always had to end like this, didn't it?" Silas screamed over the roar of the flames, his eyes wild with madness and grief. Two friends baptized in the same fire. He charged through the smoke, firing his last shots. Elias dived sideways, the bullet splintering the wood where he had been. He came up on one knee, Miller's revolver steady in his hand. He had a clear shot. He looked at Silas and the man who had been his friend, twisted by a lie he had believed for 5 years. He saw the pain beneath the rage, the broken man beneath the monster. For a fleeting second, he hesitated. Silas saw the hesitation and smiled a bloody, tragic grin. He threw his empty pistol aside and drew a long hunting knife from his belt. "If a bullet won't do it, old friend, then steel will." He lunged. Elias fired. The shot was deafening even over the fire. Silas stopped, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest, then back up at Elias. The rage in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a look of profound, weary sadness. "Elias." He whispered the name, a ghost on his lips. He stumbled forward and collapsed at Elias's feet. The fire roared, consuming the altar. The church groaned, its roof timbers threatening to give way. Elias stood over the body of his friend, smoke and sorrow stinging his eyes. He was wounded, exhausted, his soul scraped raw. But he was alive, and his family was safe. He turned and staggered through the smoke-filled nave towards the vestry door, the sounds of the dying storm and the raging fire merging into a single deafening funeral dirge. The storm broke as dawn approached. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and a gentle rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air and hissing against the smoldering ruins of the church. The fire was out, leaving a blackened, skeletal husk where the sanctuary had stood. The townspeople emerged from their shelters, blinking in the pale light like survivors from a shipwreck. They gathered in silence, staring at the destruction. Elias sat on the steps of the general store, his arm crudely bandaged by Clara, who tended to his wound with a quiet, focused intensity. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes held a new steely strength. They had survived the fire together, and their bond had been forged into something unbreakable. Sheriff Miller was tied to a hitching post, a disgraced, blubbering mess confessing his cowardice and complicity to anyone who would listen. The bodies of Silas Kane and his men were laid out in a row covered by blankets. The town looked at Elias with a new understanding. He was not just the quiet blacksmith anymore. He was the man who had stood between them and the abyss. He was their protector, their reluctant hero. Clara finished tying the bandage and looked into his eyes. "It's over," she whispered. Elias nodded, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The ghosts of the past had been faced, but their shadows lingered. He looked at Silas's covered form, a profound ache in his chest. He had not found victory in his friend's death, only a deep and tragic sorrow. In the days that followed, redemption began to heal. The townsfolk, united by the shared trauma, worked together to clear the debris and plan the rebuilding of the church. The whispers and judgmental glances that had followed Clara were gone, replaced by nods of respect and offers of help. She was no longer the outcast widow. She was Mrs. Boone, a pillar of their shattered but resilient community. Elias and Clara tended to each other's wounds, both visible and invisible. They talked late into the night, filling the silences that had once defined their relationship with words of comfort and shared hope. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, became a true home, filled with the warmth of a family that had been tested by fire and had not been consumed. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the land. The prairies were greening under the spring sun, and the skeletal frame of the new church was rising against the clear blue sky. Life was returning to redemption. One bright afternoon, Elias took Clara and the children to a small, windswept hill overlooking the town. It was a place he had come to alone many times, a place where the ghosts of Sarah and Lily felt both distant and near. But today, he was not alone. He sat on a blanket with Clara, watching as Samuel and the girls chased butterflies in the tall grass. He called Thomas over. The boy came and sat beside him, his expression serious, his eyes holding the wisdom of one who has seen too much too soon. From his pocket, Elias produced a small, carefully wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it and handed it to the boy. It was a replica of his old U.S. Marshal's badge, whittled from a piece of solid oak, its surface sanded smooth and polished to a soft gleam. "This is for you," Elias said, his voice quiet. "It's not a symbol of fighting, Thomas. It's a symbol of protecting, of standing up for those who can't stand for themselves. It's about honor, not violence." Thomas took the wooden badge, his fingers tracing the star. He looked up at Elias, his eyes shining with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. He pinned it carefully to his small shirt. Then Elias took out another object, the real badge. It was tarnished and bent, its silver finish worn from years of service and sorrow. It was the last symbol of his pain, his guilt, the man he used to be. He stood up, walked a few paces to a spot beneath a lone, sturdy oak tree, and began to dig a small hole in the rich earth with his hands. Clara came and stood beside him, her hand resting on his back. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the metal star inside. He looked at it for a long moment, a final farewell to the ghost that had haunted him for so long. Then he covered it with dirt, burying his past for good. He stood and turned to Clara. He took her hands in his gaze clear and steady. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of grief or uncertainty. It was a silence of peace, of contentment, of a future waiting to be built. He was no longer running. He was home. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, promising kiss under the wide-open sky. The children's laughter drifted up from the fields below, a sweet, hopeful melody. Together, they stood on the hill, a new family forged in the heart of the Wild West, ready to build their new life, their own redemption.